Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Finding Me on the ITV network. South Africa's transition from apartheid to democracy was hailed as a success. New phrases were coined that described us as the Rainbow Nation. And with political power now in the hands of the black man, everything was supposedly, suddenly going to be okay. But was the transition a success? And have South Africans fully understood and grasped the one identity that was consciously used to dehumanize the people of color? This identity was nestled in race. Today with me are two incredible human beings. Ndumiso Delport is a lecturer in philosophy at the University of South Africa, and Ndumiso Delport is an assistant lecturer at the University of Pretoria. So welcome to both of you, and thank you very much for making the time to be here with me this morning.
Thank you.
Ndumiso and Delport, you know, we have had some interesting conversations in the reading group that we have. And I would like to pick up on some of these discussions and bring these issues to the front, because I feel that many a time these conversations are not carried to the wider public. And so let's start, but first, of course, because we have a layman audience, to start by defining concepts. And perhaps if I can start with you, and Delport, if you would like to bring in something, you can add to that. My main question to you is, what is race? What is racism, and what is racial identity?
I think the interesting way to start, because these are highly politicized concepts, is to begin with the problem of racism. How I understand racism really is as white supremacy. If one looks in the dictionary for an entry on racism, one will find something like the theory that human abilities are determined by race. So in terms of the English language, any association which is made between human behavior, capacity, and race is a racist claim. But if we look at the history of politics, we find that these claims about the quality of human beings in relation to race really originate from a very specific location, and they become an obsession at a period of time in European history when the conquest of the so-called other worlds becomes a priority in the expansion of Europe. Then you begin to find all sorts of development of discourses which create a taxonomy and typology of races and classify types of human beings. So for me, racism then becomes white supremacy, because you know, the two classes of race which exist are those which are the European people and the non-European people. And racism then is the modus of justification of why it is morally acceptable to do certain things to these people, to take certain things from these people, because they don't enjoy the same quality of human being. Yeah, so this is quite basically how I understand.
So from the concept of racism. And for you, Delport, how would you then consider racial identity and race?
Well, I think, Ndumiso, actually, the idea of looking through this at white supremacy, I think, would be the best way, because also, and especially in South Africa, you see through 350 years that there was a class, a minority class, being able to entrench themselves in the upper middle class and, you know, higher classes of society. And this was only possible through a systematic exploitation and a systematic distancing from those that are not white and that are not part of the minority. And also, I think what Ndumiso also brings out is that the definitions, the dictionary definitions of racism also very much follows a European or a non-African way of identifying with the self and the other, in the sense that being black is being not white. Yes. And I think in South Africa especially, a racial identity then has to do with how your race determines your position within society and also your position within the bigger class structure.
And I'm just curious, because you're a young South African, you're a young white South African. When you raise the question of race, racial injustice, racial prejudice, white supremacy, as Ndumiso has spoken about, usually very many young white South Africans become uncomfortable because they don't know how to relate these concepts to their present identity and their present circumstances. And what would you say is key to getting beyond this?
You know, first of all, it should be an engagement with our history, and it should be an engagement with our here, I use it very specifically as referring to South Africa, the history of South Africa, the intellectual history of South Africa, and also to engage with these things. That's not necessarily easy. I mean, to stand up and admit that, you know, one has benefited from apartheid has become almost a rite of passage for certain, like, liberal, you know, Afrikaners, how I benefited from apartheid. And I mean, the critiques one can level against it is massive, but I think that is a first step in the sense of realizing and making this conversation open, where we can talk about things like Afrikaner affirmative action, about the mineral and energy complex, about the collusion between the apartheid government and corruption, etc., etc., and think about this in a way where we can actually discuss and see our own position within it.
Based on what Blanche has just been saying, in part of our conversations, and I think which was interesting, and I'd need you to be concise because we have to go to a break just now. We spoke about that whole concept of the Rainbow Nation, and you explained something phenomenal to me, and I would like you to share that idea again about the whole hypocrisy or the duality within that term.
Okay. Well, it's been said by others before myself that one interesting problem with the metaphor of the rainbow is that it contains a critique within itself, because of course we all know that the rainbow is a result of the refraction of white light through a prism, and it has been suggested that the rainbow is really the new form of white supremacy. And there is the additional fact that, of course, the rainbow does not contain black within itself. And so the critique against this obsession with diversity and multiculturality is precisely that it's a discourse which is generated by white supremacy to negotiate a new space for itself. But we find that in actual practice, it still marginalizes black people. We're having this discussion in English despite being in an African country. We teach in English and Afrikaans. Our exams are in English and Afrikaans, which are the languages of the conqueror, despite the pronouncement of this diversity. So officially you get the recognition of all peoples, but in the actual practice of the state, policy and society, we see that the cultures which are represented in the rainbow are really, even the rainbow itself is an English word. So there are many things which are contained within this concept, which actually reveal or portray its actual function.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you to hold the thought there. When we come back to Blanche, I would like you to perhaps just add a little bit to that, maybe from people who will say, but the Rainbow Nation was coined by Archbishop Tutu, and he is a black person. So what is the contradiction there, and why are we, making a big thing about a simple term? So when we come back from the break, we will get back straight away to the question on the Rainbow Nation. Welcome back to the second segment of Finding Me on the ITV Networks, and with me today is Ndumiso Delport and to Blanche Delport. And before we went to the break, we were speaking about the duality in the term of Rainbow Nation, and of course, as Ndumiso explained, but I posed another question, and to Blanche, I would like you to take it forward. Where somebody will come back and say, but it was coined by Archbishop Tutu and it wasn't said by somebody else. Mm-hmm. So how would you then respond to that?
Well, I think I'd like to respond to this in two ways. First, talking about, Archbishop Tutu's own conception of messianic politics as being, with his history and liberation theology, and just theology in a whole, and then on the other hand, the idea of myth-making and post-apartheid myth-making. On the one hand, I think the fact that it's been coined by Desmond Tutu, I mean, speaks also a lot to his own political ideology and his own way of seeing politics and thinking of politics as that which is to come, democracy to come, a situation to come. And I think taking it within that concept, like we must also understand that, speaking to what Ndumiso said also about the prism of light, like a rainbow is not something that is permanent. It is something that changes, it's something that moves, and it's something that can only be perceived from a certain angle.
That is correct.
So I think, I mean, for me the Rainbow Nation can be a helpful term, but, and this brings me to my second point with the concept of myth making. I think in South Africa, and the ANC specifically is very good with this, is making these myths, the myth of the Freedom Charter, the myth of the democratic South Africa. I mean, this is something that gets perpetuated, and I think this is what Ndumiso shows very well, is that there's a myth of the Rainbow Nation, of being this, you know, this harmonious society where everybody lives together and everything is, you know, everything is fine. In theory, this is how it works, yes, but I mean, we need to go look at how this gets perpetuated as a myth that is definitely not. All people don't live according to the Rainbow Nation principles. Yes. This is a fact.
Okay, but then what is the difference between being against racism and being anti-racist?
Well, I wonder, being against racism and being anti-racist, or being
Yes.
Okay, okay. If the question means the difference between non-racialism and anti-racism. Yes. How I understand it really is that the non-racialist movement moves from the presumption that because in science it has been demonstrated that racism is fallacious, and so there are no biological entities which have these capacities and can be classified quite neatly into racial categories, that we can move from that premise to the conclusion then that there is no racism. Because there is no logical basis for it, we sort of take it, what you call a color-blind approach. I don't see blacks, I don't see whites, we're all human beings. Yes. The problem with this is that it unfortunately assumes a great and mythical power of rationality which does not in true fact exist. And the fact that there is no actual biological category doesn't follow that there isn't a social category. In philosophy, we speak about social ontology. Races have a being, but that being is socially constructed. It's constructed in the language we speak, but it's also reinforced by the ways in which societies are arranged according to people who believe that these things were real. And so you will find a society which will produce poor education rates for blacks, which will produce certain different life chances for people of color than those people who are called white. And so you do have a reality of racism. Now, anti-racism moves from the presumption of this reality, that we cannot make the assumption that the rational position that races don't exist also means that we can simply repudiate the social implications, that the world has been historically structured by racism, and that we need to invoke the reality of this concept and all of its implications in order to undo its harms. And so anti-racism then is a much more realistic and rigorous position which acknowledges that racism is not a non, it's actually a functioning and real structure which requires a various number of strategies in the opposition of.
Okay, but now based on what Ndu just said, that it is a reality, is there a place for the different races in South Africa?
Yes, there is a place for the different races in South Africa, but not necessarily. I think the type of non-racialism that we see from someone like Ndira Mazibuko is problematic in the sense that I was referring to the concept of messianic politics now, of this idea of a politics to come, a democracy to come, a society to come, and then also an individual, a South African to come. And I think with the type of non-racialism that assumes, okay, you know, we've gone through 350 years of racial exploitation and unequal development. And now, you know, there was a democratic election, we had a constitutive moment, and then, you know, now everything's changed and there's a non-racial society. I think that is not only problematic, but I think that's dangerous, because that doesn't address still the very much parallel structures, parallel institutions that maybe not legally, but still, as Noom said, socially serves different classes of the society, which most of the time in South Africa is based on race. So yes, I think there is a place, but this needs to be negotiated and this needs to be thought. And I mean, Noom's also mentioned the fact of speaking English, of teaching in English and Afrikaans. I mean,
but can I just stop you there? You know, ordinary people will say, but the language of the world is English. You know, that of course you have to, if you want to survive economically, if you want to survive socially, you have to have English. So why are we harping on something which is the norm? Basically, South Africans need English.
No, that's true. I mean, if we see English as a lingua franca, I think it's fine. As a trade language, yes, that is fine. But I think it should be acknowledged, the fact that, I mean, English in itself, just because it's useful doesn't mean it's good, or doesn't mean it has...
the ultimate.
Yes, or does it, that it has like an inherent value in it. It's a utility language, yes. But I mean, the point that I just also want to make is that this speaks also to an engagement in history. I mean, we were having a discussion on this as well once, and you know, we talked about the idea of being African, when you said, well, you know, it's very interesting if you see how little white South Africans can speak any
other language,
engages with any other cultures except their own culture, and then like some sort of European culture.
But it's not only amongst the whites. I think the Indians and the Coloureds themselves too don't know very many African languages. And I think you wanted to add something there.
Well, in recognizing that English has a great deal of power, and that one cannot do much in the world today without speaking English, is not also to make the concession that it is the only language which should be spoken. Many different countries continue to speak in Scandinavia, for instance, in France, in Germany, even in China. People will learn English, of course, but they will still also have a primary language. This takes us to the relationship between language and culture, which is how this question of white Africans, I've suggested before that white people have not wanted to be Africans for the last 300 years. They have specifically self-referenced themselves as Europeans and whites for a long time, until very recently, when it became politically useful to become African. But if you want to see the commitment of white South Africa to not becoming African, you can see it in the very existence of that community, which for me is the first sign of a sort of social commitment to non-integration. And that idea of not becoming part of a society begins with ignoring its language, because its language contains its custom, it contains its philosophy and understanding of place in the world. So by refusing to hear the other speak, you refuse to engage in the kind of dialogue which would actually dissolve this alterity. So this commitment can be seen in the existence of a community that started amongst a few thousand people who landed in the Cape, who continue to grow in number. That suggests they've maintained the kind of racial purity. That suggests they've not become part of the society, because I do believe that white people wouldn't even exist if they indeed were Africans. There would in fact be no reason to refer to white people at all and a special category of Africans, because we would simply have become one people. But we are not one people.
Yes. Tibelansh, would you like to add something to that before we go to the break?
I actually just want to present a quote maybe. In the previous edition of the Getting Ahead, the Mail and Guardian supplement, Surin Pillai wrote an article on decolonizing the humanities. And he had a quote there where he said, the one thing that all South Africans shares is their Eurocentrism. So I would then maybe just stop there.
Okay, great. So we're going to the break, and when we come back, we're in the final segment, and we still have a lot of issues to unpack. But we'll see you after the break. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the final segment of Finding Me on the ITV networks. And before we went into the break, Blanche mentioned that basically, well, all South Africans are essentially Eurocentric. So how do we move from that, Blanche? And I would like you to reference this specifically with relation to the article that both you and Ndumiso wrote in the Mail and Guardian recently. Can you please tell us, or tell the audience, what the article was about and what motivated you to write it?
Well, yeah, the article is titled "Rehumanizing the Colonialities." We were motivated in writing the article because of the arguments and the debates around the Humanities Charter and the Africanization and transformation of the syllabus. And we thought we wanted to make an interjection but within this debate from a position of postgraduate students and young academics coming into South Africa, coming into the South African Academy. And the big point we were making there, referring to Valentin Mudimbe's concept on the idea and the invention of Africa, is that we have the whole idea of a colonial logic is the one that perpetuates a very intense subject-object dichotomy, a self-other relationship. And this leads us into the situation that now where we have a course on Western philosophy and on ethno-philosophy, or on African philosophy. It gets broken up into such sovereign, small little compartments with their specific specialists that they can't speak to each other. In that sense, I think we've also made a plea in saying, like, we have a responsibility in being in South Africa to think South Africa, to think about our experiences and to try and address our questions here, not only from a European perspective, but from a perspective where we feel comfortable. And also, I mean, just to add to that, I mean, we've been accused of, some people have accused of being charterists and being soft and sympathetic to Bladen Zimande's line. And I just want to say now also that if one speaks about the transformation of knowledge or the Africanization of knowledge, this is also absurd, because this also just strengthens the same dialectic and the same idea of Africa that we got from the Europeans. So it's a question of opening up a polylogue, opening up a position where we can discuss these things without it being an issue, without it being a claim of radical transformation or Africanization, and able to interject in the middle of this discussion.
And I think it's important because even from the answers that our students gave in the university, you will see that when they relate any answer, they always relate it to the foreign or to the external. Very seldom will you get a student who will start from the internal or from the immediate. They will usually use US as an example or something that has happened in Europe, but very, very seldom contextualize any discussion or debate from the South African perspective or even from Africa. So Ndumiso, can you please add to this dialogue perhaps, and what I find very much also is the ideas about Africans and how these are perpetuated in the current syllabi.
All right. I think what's important to consider, and I raised this a little bit within the article, is that the university in South Africa was really founded as a place to keep the children of the conqueror abreast with the developments at home. And very much this legacy still exists. The university sees itself as a factory which churns out a product which is able to play on the international market, which is able to compete or be in line with people outside. In the humanities, the human being is the center of the study. It's the interpreting subject and everything. Man is the measure of all things. And because, of course, of the racist history of the idea that Africans are not human beings proper, the university was no place for the African. If the African was to be studied by the universities, it was in the disciplines of old anthropology and ethnography as an exotic kind of specimen, and it was a study of difference. How do its skulls differ from us, its rituals differ from us? And so very much the South African university still preserves this legacy, where the African is considered an alterity. Once we start to speak of alternative medicine in the reference to traditional African medicine, when we speak of alternative approaches when we describe the ways in which the people who have lived here since time immemorial have done things, you know, and we speak of it as an alternative. It tells us what the institution sees itself as. What we have very much is a European university in Africa rather than an African university. And so very much even in the material plane of economics, the university student still sees himself working on Wall Street or working for a company from Wall Street which is in Johannesburg. But very much the university becomes a complicit factory which manufactures the kind of people who want to sell the country without creating the kind of critical insight to see what is really it is that's happening. And there is a rich history of thought in writing, you know, as well as in oral history of thinking about our place in the world on the continent. And very little of this is reflected upon in the university. In fact, if you looked at the New School for Social Research in New York or many of the other European universities, you'd find that they take the thought of Africa much more seriously than many of the universities
and I think that's
which are
what Blanche,
here.
you were saying in one of our conversations, that you actually have to go overseas to study about Africa or African history, isn't it? You can't really get it here.
Yeah, no, I think this is, you know, this is the type of ironies we need to look at, and we need to consider that as students from Africa, to get a training in African history and African thought, African economic thought, we need to go to a European university. We need to go to an American university. I mean, this for me is, you know, this. I think this is the biggest irony, and this is, I think this is the one thing that we also try to show in our article. I mean, being a postgraduate student in South Africa, you've got a very specific angst, and this is the angst: how am I going to get a job at a European or American university? How am I going to go teach there? How am I going to compete on the medieval classics, on Italian literature with people that is Italian? And I mean, this for me is a funny question, in the sense that, like, why can't we present Africa from Africa? Why do we need to think of Africa, present Africa, and contextualize Africa always within Europe, always within America? I mean, you were mentioning it. There's this idea of, you know, we're trained, you can think, but the moment that you need to use authority, you need to go overseas. So think, but then you need to authoritize, you know, use the authority of some ancient, you know, some ancient white-bearded man. You know, and this is just how it works out. And I think this is maybe today, you know, 2013, it's a time for us to start looking at this ironies quite seriously and saying why, you know, asking these questions.
Okay, so now my very last question, and I'm going to give it to you briefly. Is South Africa free and democratic?
I would say South Africa may very well be democratic, but it is certainly not free. And I'm not even sure what the relationship between these two things are. A problem with the current representation of the struggle for liberation is that the struggle for liberation is a struggle for people to be able to vote. And unfortunately, the questions of historical justice, of the conquest, and the defectivity of sovereignty have not been raised. And the question of freedom immediately takes us back to the question of justice. It cannot be so that the basis of our conquest is that Africans are not human beings, and therefore it's okay to appropriate land and resources from them, and then to declare that they are free while not returning that which has been taken. So until we also address the question of historical justice and the restoration of sovereignty, we cannot begin to speak about freedom. And I certainly think it's a premature pronouncement, which is still to make many determinations in the future of the South African struggle for liberation.
Okay, so as a parting thought, what would be your final advice to the audience, and what is your favorite quote?
My advice to the audience is actually to look at things, you know, especially to the so-called educated people, to put their books down for a little bit and look at things for yourself and listen to the people around you. Very much, you get much greater political insights from the so-called common people who do not have the obfuscation of learning to prevent them from seeing the obvious realities on the ground. I think our learning could do a lot more with this sort of perspective. And my favorite quote is one from the film The Matrix, I think, which is said by the Frenchman. It says, choice does not exist. It's an instrument that those with power use to control those without. I think it's quite apt in the history of politics here when we consider the vote as a supposed existence, as something which is equal to both freedom, it really is simply a facade which hides the true fact that sovereignty is unreturned.
And for you, Tiblan, what would you like to leave as a parting thought?
Well, as a parting thought, I think what Noom says it quite well is it's basically just get involved. There's a lot of stuff going on in South Africa at this stage, and I think it's the time for as many South Africans or people living in South Africa to get involved in whatever way they can, in order to contribute to whatever way they can. Because I mean, you see, it's voting time now, so the IEC will probably put on the banners that says, if you can't vote, you can't complain. I mean, this is the rhetoric we use, and I think, stop complaining and start doing something. At the end of the day, this is the only way in which these things can work. And then my favorite quote, I asked her for water and she gave me gasoline, by American blues musician Alan Wolf.
Thank you very much
Karasha.
for that. Thank you to you, Ndumiso, and to Tiblan, and for sharing these thoughts with us. And I would like to leave with a quote by Martin Luther King, where he said, "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy." So, fi amanillah, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Until the next time.